Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Max Kolbe channel. This is another Escaping Atheism project, and one I think you'll find particularly interesting, especially if you're interested in the subject of science fiction and fantasy literature. Oh, just a moment. Got a little sound issue there, sorry. Before we begin, please give us a like, please give us a subscribe, please give us your support, financial and otherwise, on escapingatheism.com. Tonight joining me is award-winning science fiction writer Brian Niemeier. Say hello to everybody, Brian.
Good evening.
Good evening. Brian is the author of Soul Dancer and at least a couple of other books. You were involved somewhat in the Sad Puppies campaign too, were you not?
See, I was selected for the recommended reading list for Sad Puppies last year, and also the Rabid Puppies, like I said, Soul Dancer made the list there, and then also for the Campbells. So I did become a John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer finalist back in, I believe it was the 2015 Hugos, and then Soul Dancer won the first year of Dragon Awards in 2016. It's the first book to win Best Horror Novel, and it's the only self-published novel to win that year.
I see an article on you here in something called Subversive SF.
Superversive.
Superversive SF. Yep, there's a copy of that right there. Make sure to give me a link to your best website so that I can include it after the show, so that people can find your work, find your books.
Right now, it's brianniemeier.com. Just myname.com. That's my blog.
Yeah, good luck. I bet you nobody can spell your name right. So, but I'll try and remember to get that in, get into the notes when we get going, or after we're done here today. Now, we're going to be discussing the subject that might surprise people, but it's the subject of atheism and science fiction. Now, Brian and I are both religious, and as it happens, we're both Catholic. That's not really by design. We interview people of all kinds of different religions here. I even interviewed a witch once. No lie. But in any case, Brian is, he's also been, and he knows our mutual, we have a mutual acquaintance in Christopher Lansdowne of Missing the Mark. Brian and I are going to talk today about a subject you almost never hear, which is atheism and science fiction. Although I understand Box Day has written about that sometimes. One of the things that's interesting for me is that I grew up reading science fiction as a kid. And I had a poor religious upbringing, a schizophrenic upbringing, and decided I didn't believe in God, didn't care about church at a pretty early age, and stayed that way. And like a lot of nerd kids who was totally uninterested in the spiritual, I drifted right into Star Trek and to a lesser extent Star Wars, but I had a preference for science fiction, especially what they called hard science fiction. So I was a big fan of names like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, even the fantasy-oriented stuff. I liked Anne McCaffrey's Pern novels better than magic-oriented fantasy. I did read a certain amount of fantasy, but it was right there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so names like Harlan Ellison, Fred Pohl, Jerry Purnell, Larry Niven. I knew Dr. Purnell somewhat for a few years. Amazing man, recently passed away. Basically, I got out of much interest in literary science fiction by the early 90s, but there was a good 20 plus years there, but I mostly just read that. And what you used to get out of something called the Old Science Fiction Book Club, I burned through much of their collection. And I used to read Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction Magazine and Analog and something called Omni that was around back in that day. So I am a super fan when it comes to old school science fiction, because I also like stuff from the 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the things that never truly occurred to me until recently is that there was a slow creep of atheism into science fiction, starting, as I perceive it, somewhat with Star Trek, not too blatantly and overtly, But you see an ideological atheism is in Isaac Asimov, in Arthur Clarke, in Anne McCaffrey, and actually a ton of other science fiction authors, some of my very favorites. And it is kind of striking when you run into that, when you start seeing, well, atheism is a worldview, and it will inform an author's perspective and how they do things. Somewhat more wild, you know, more spiritually, somewhat more inclined were people like Robert Heinlein. But then there was a whole other, there was no good reason that I can think of that science fiction should just be restricted to an atheistic perspective. Yet it seemed like an awful lot, now that I look at it, an awful lot of the authors I chose to read and write that I liked were ideological atheists. And I had begun wondering recently why that is. And Brian Niemeier and I began talking about it. And where do you think it began, Brian? Because, Brian, you've got a lot of research on this. That's the biggest point. Brian has done a ton of research on this, and he knows other people who've done research on it. So where do you think the ideological atheist component of science fiction, which is in no way required, where do you think that began?
That began in 1937.
That is mighty specific. Tell me about it.
It is. Yeah, but I've got a reason for it. And like I said, I'm drawing on multiple sources here. Got to give a shout out to Jeffro Johnson, the author of Appendix N, who went back and read Gary Gygax's list of recommended reading and informed Dungeons and Dragons, and completely caused a complete paradigm shift in his thinking on science fiction. I've got to give a shout out to the QQ, who has done a couple of excellent videos with his partner Dan Wolfgang. And we've got to give a shout out to John Mollison, Nathan Housley, many others. So where did the infiltration, you know, the convergence of science fiction begin? And as I said, 1937 is very specific, but there's a good rationale for citing that particular year. First of all, 1937 was the year that John W. Campbell assumed editorship of the former pulp magazine Astounding, which he changed to
Analog, right?
So yeah, well, he first changed the title to Astounding SF. I don't know if it later became Analog, but that was the year that he took over Astounding, and he brought to it a very specific definition of what constitutes science fiction, which was more of the hard SF, or as I like to call it, big men with screwdrivers fiction, right? And this wasn't necessarily like a hard positive atheism in all cases, but whereas before, in the era of the pulps, you had heroes who were operating in a universe that was unabashedly informed by Western Christian values specifically. They took it for granted. And you had clear stories of clear-cut good versus evil. You had the Space Knight defeating the Galactic Overlord and winning the hand of the Space Princess. You had explorers getting to the Hollow Earth and finding primitive civilizations and saying, oh, well, we got to convert these poor people to Christ. Right? That was all taken for granted.
All right, so now let me catch the audience up a little bit, because I know all the stuff you just said, because again, I'm just familiar with all these names and somewhat with the dates and everything. Here's a page on John W. Campbell, who he's talking about there. Now, he was an incredibly important science fiction editor and writer. I don't know that much of his fiction did survive. I think I read a short anthology of his best fiction once. Not that great, but not horrible either by any means. But he was just like Isaac Asimov, like viewed him as the most important figure in his life, just about. It was almost like he was a substitute father. You can read about that in Isaac Asimov's autobiography books, which I've read. And he was an enormous influence on a ton of other very well-known names. In fact, it does seem to have reached a point where, with Campbell, where if John W. Campbell didn't like your work, you might not work in science fiction. I mean, I don't know how long that went on. And what you're saying is that with the influx of John W. Campbell, he more or less was an atheist, and he didn't respect the spiritual. And so he only wanted to publish stuff that was straight technological, assuming a materialist universe, and shying away from ideas like good and evil and that sort of thing.
Incrementally, I don't know personally what Campbell's personal beliefs were. You probably know more about that than I do, but what you got with Campbell was the sort of, you had more of the godly man here replaced with the worldly man, who was more of the like classical liberalism, but yeah, more modernist, more rationalistic, where, okay, there might be some sort of transcendent or supernatural dimension of the universe, but we're going to set that aside, and we can't verify that. But he still had these characters operating from a vestigial, really a priori remnant of Christian morality. Like they'll have a code of honor, or they'll keep their word.
Robert Heinlein was one of those. Robert Heinlein was pretty harshly anti-God, pretty anti-Christian. He seems to have had, and this is common when people age, he seems to have gotten a little more spiritual, especially when he aged. But he maintained his rigorous hatred of religion throughout, and he was one of the more libertarian ones of the science fiction authors. The ones who were more socialist-oriented, I think, were even more hardcore than he was on that sort of thing. Because Heinlein would write sympathetic religious characters. He did so more than once. He would at least do it once in a while, even though it was very negative. But that shift did occur because religion is either absent or a negative in most of the big names that I remember coming out of the John W. Campbell universe. And Campbell's world influence continued past his death. He died in 1971. Isaac Asimov started something called Isaac Asimov Science Fiction Magazine, which ran for quite a while, because he just wanted another John Campbell, and he wanted to publish more stuff in that vein. It's
right, and Asimov and Heinlein were two of Campbell's big three sci-fi authors. So yes, you can see the atheist, reductionist, materialist ethos start to seep into contemporary science fiction.
And you know, it's interesting.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean all the material was bad, but it was all very much materialist and scientific naturalist, with a hint of weird spirituality now and then.
Right, and I'm not trying to knock Campbellian science fiction. There were masterpieces produced during that era, to be sure, but it was a silver age. Okay, the real golden age of science fiction was the pulps. It's Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's Robert E. Howard. It's Abraham Merritt.
So let me switch that to what you said in some of your introductory remarks. You gave us this book by Jeffro Johnson called Appendix N: The Literary History of Dungeons and Dragons. And this is a book that in the old Dungeons and Dragons, in the appendices, I remember that, because here's how much of a nerd I am. Not only was a science fiction, Star Wars, Star Trek, reading the hardcore science fiction 2 nerd, but I played D&D pretty much when it first came out, at least when it was called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons version 1. I started when that came out. So very early 80s. And I remember Appendix N, and I remember looking through Appendix N. This is a book about that appendix. I took a similar journey to Jeffro's book by just looking at this. This is a copy of Gygax's original Appendix N. It's not that long. It's a four dozen authors, and some with specific books listed, some not. I remember deciding I really liked Gygax, so over the years I would sometimes consult the list and read something off of it. So I've read a lot of it, and what's interesting to me about this is, first, it's obvious, and I always knew this, they overplay how much he owes to Tolkien. Because while he did take the elves and the orcs and the halflings especially, undoubtedly strong Tolkien influence, there was so much else in Dungeons and Dragons that it really was kind of weird. Like, I remember even when we were kids at the time, we were thinking about, well, can we reenact The Hobbit with this? And it's like, it really wouldn't work too good. The game wasn't quite designed like that. I mean, you could, but not really. And You made this point before, and I'll let you expand on it, but until you pointed it out to me, when I look at Gygax's list, there are much more spiritually inclined authors here, quite a few more. Furthermore, Gary Gygax is, especially the original D&D, including the stuff from the early 70s when it was just D&D, had a strong ethos of good and evil. And some of the early clerics, they didn't even bring in multiple gods to worship. It was just kind of assumed you were getting from, you know, you would name your god, but there was a kind of a loose assumption you might as well just be a Christian or something. But in this world, if your priest gets spells, it wasn't quite that explicit, but it was almost like that. There was a strong demarcation of good and evil. And that's actually something you'll find in theist literature, people who are spiritual, not even necessarily Christian, but certainly in the Christian worldview, but even in other religions, the strong idea that there is good, there is evil, and that there are forces beyond us. That was strong in the original D&D game, and that was strong in most of the authors on this list, isn't it? And yet none of them are the big heroes of science fiction these days. There, I just said a lot there. Go ahead, comment.
Right. Well, that's a great segue, because there's another reason why those authors on Appendix N have been essentially thrown down the memory hole. And that has to do with another Flashpoint incident that also occurred in 1937, thanks to the Futurian Society of New York. Now, these were a group of guys, their science fiction club, who had been kicked out of or destroyed every other sci-fi club they'd been in. They were renowned as agitators and troublemakers, and they were contemporaries of Campbell. Now, the Futurians were founded by Donald A. Wollheim, John Michel, Damon Knight, Fred Pohl. So the cast of characters that sci-fi nerds will be familiar with.
I brought up the fan lore Wikipedia page, and I'll make sure people get a link of that too. Yeah. Right. Members of that, I see the names of the list here. Isaac Asimov, and by the way, I've read most of these authors. Isaac Asimov, James Blish, Virginia Kidd, Damon Knight, Cyril Kornbluth, Robert W. Lowndes, Judith Merrill, John B. Mitchell, Frederick Pohl, very interesting man, Frederick Pohl, Richard Wilson, and Donald A. Wollheim. These were some very influential names. I don't know them all, but I know quite a few of them. And Frederick Pohl,
fascinating guy.
Not only was Isaac Asimov the prolific author, but a publisher himself. And Frederick Pohl was an editor and had worked as an agent to promote other people's works. So these men really had a huge influence.
Huge. Fred Pohl,
seen as science fiction itself.
Yeah, Pohl edited Marvel Science Stories, Dynamic Stories, really more publications than I can count. Donald Wollheim edited Avon Fantasy for years. In 1952, Ace hired him to edit their paperback imprint. And by the way, that was where he pirated the American paperback release of Lord of the Rings, by the way, but that's another story. Before he went on to found Daw Books, which publishes SJWs like Patrick Rothfuss and Seanan McGuire today. Okay, so they're still having an influence. They're still catering more to authors who are dismissive of the transcendent or more culturally Marxist or even atheist. But the reason 1937 is important for the Futurians, okay, is the Futurians were dedicated to a philosophy called Michelism, which was developed by John Michel, which claimed to attempt to promote more progressive thinking among science fiction fans. Okay, and they weren't above stooping to propaganda. The Futurians got kicked out of the first World Science Fiction Convention by Sam Moskowitz because they were handing out flyers calling him a dictator. Okay, so they would go in and they would agitate and they would spread like pro-Marxist, and Marxism is officially atheist propaganda.
Yeah, well, they were actually, well, I don't know that Asimov was ever a card-carrying communist. I'm 98% Frederick Pohl was, and he was always basically a commie at heart. But you're saying these guys, some of these guys were at that convention and were openly being Marxist. Not,
yeah, Michel.
Atheism was and by the way, anybody who's listening needs to hear this. Lenin himself and Marx himself said atheism is at the core of communism. So y'all can stop arguing. The communists themselves agree the atheism is at the core of the communism. But anyway, you saying these guys were openly Marxist, and I kind of knew that about some of them.
Right. Michel, again, the guy who developed the Futurians' core philosophy, was a young communist until he was old enough, and then he did become a card-carrying member of the American Communist Party and was a self-described Marxist. Now, he wrote a speech that was delivered by Donald A. Wollheim at the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention in Philadelphia in 1937. The title of the speech is Mutation or Death. Now, I'll give you some time to pull that up. That is a seminal speech. It declared science fiction dead. Gee, where have we heard that before recently? Right? Now, science fiction fans don't have to be your audience anymore.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we did get that, didn't we? Mutation or Death. I'm going to see if I can find that. I think it's in Fancyclopedia here. Yeah, transcript of his famous speech declaring science fiction dead. Right? Because you don't have to make your fans. Oh, my God. I have read this speech years ago, and it just hit me what this is. This is, somebody should read this. This is a social justice warrior manifesto.
Totally, front to back.
Front to back, that's what this is. I'm remembering it now. Science fiction stops because it's got all these backwards, primitive, barbaric superstitions, manly men, womanly women, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if he calls out sexism or racism in here, but it wouldn't surprise me. I don't remember offhand. It's totally a leftist Marxist rag. Basically, like saying video games are dead, like saying science fiction is dead and needs to go new directions. And what they almost always mean is they want anti-heroes, they want moral ambiguity, they want grit, they want no religion, no God, unless it's portrayed negatively. That's exactly what Marxists tend to like. They also tend to like a lot more sex in it.
Right.
And to like to push the boundaries on sex. It's just an is. I've watched how from generation to generation, because I've read science fiction that old and older. You are right. There is a demarcation where all of a sudden authors who were more spiritually inclined were more or less, they had to carve out their own niche because they weren't in the big in club, were they?
Exactly. And that's why we can point to 1937 as a hard turning point, because if anytime you hear someone tell you that science fiction was always political, no, that's a lie. Before 1937, it was not. It was about entertaining readers. It was about escapism, the same escapism that Michel and Wollheim attacked in favor of seeking utopianism through science.
Well, they want to do what? And you use the word escapism, and obviously they tend to use the word escapism like it's a bad thing. But of course, if you're reading fiction, you usually are trying to escape something. At the same time, I've read some of these more, like going back to Appendix N here. I mean, there would be, I'm not going to hold up any of these as great philosophers, but there would be more philosophical depth in a lot of these authors than the atheist authors, who seem to always think, be more dry, be more materialist, and maybe have more daring sex. That you know, that was the idea of being daring, and and also daring is being blasphemous or hateful toward religion and religious people, and that's what counts as daring. And it's not what you see in this Gary Gygax list that the original Dungeons and Dragons was like, is it? And these were all very successful authors.
Exactly. And Nathan Housley, who's in the chat with us tonight, pointed out that Manly Wade Wellman in particular is an excellent example of a writer who had to make his own path because he didn't want to write Campbellian propaganda. So there were authors who, there were a couple of ways to get around the Futurians and the Campbellian clique, but there were really only a couple of magazines that were only publishing science fiction authors for entertainment and escapism. Because, yeah, another book that I referred you to, Breakfast in the Ruins by Barry Malzberg, the legendary editor.
Breakfast in the Ruins. I have it up on Goodreads here. Science Fiction in the Last Millennium by Barry Malzberg. It looks like the Goodreads bullies haven't gotten to it, but in any case, so what's Barry Malzberg got to say?
Well, he pointed out that this group of New York-based science fiction writers, editors, and critics that he called the Central 50, which, from what I understand, were basically synonymous with the Futurians, they just converged and took over all these editorships, all these gatekeeping posts. You know, they established themselves as the gatekeepers of, again, all but 2 science fiction magazines. And it got to the point where if you didn't have a personal in with one of the Central 50, you weren't getting published. And they definitely did control for ideological bias. They published people who agreed with them.
And you know, that influential link works because a lot of these authors, like for example, Isaac Asimov, while he never had much luck in Hollywood, he would get called in to consult. He even got a consult, a lengthy one with Woody Allen on his film Sleeper. So yeah, these guys were influential within the genre of science fiction and became to dominate it. I can see how now. And that seems to have just been a continuing, almost ratcheting trend since then. Because what I recall also is that there were these other authors that I would read who I now know to have been spiritual, although they weren't in your face with it all the time, depended on what you read, right?
Right.
Certainly the one everybody kind of knows because he got destroyed, his reputation got slimed, was Orson Scott Card. Now, some of his fantasy work, it's just so overtly religious you can't miss it. But when you read things like Ender's Game, it's not there, right? You wouldn't even know. But he got othered. There used to be a guy very popular. I think he still has an audience, Gene Wolfe. He's
yes.
Religious.
Yeah, actually, I graduated from the parish school of the church that he attends.
I didn't even know Gene Wolfe was still alive. I apologize. Cool, but
No,
that's cool. That's very cool.
I just saw him not too long ago, so I can confirm.
And now that you mention it, okay, I just mentioned 2 huge names, Jerry Purnell and Larry Niven. Those were both religious men, and they were rarely in that clique. The clique didn't think much of them, even though Jerry Purnell and Larry Niven were brilliant, and especially writing together. But they weren't liked by the literary clique at all.
Right. The Hugos just awarded Jerry Purnell recently. He finished in 6th place behind no award. Jerry Purnell. That really tells you all you need to know about the Hugos.
Nobody sane would consider Jerry Purnell anything other than an exceptionally good writer. And if you look at 3 or 4 of the books that he did with Larry Niven, especially. Larry Niven's also brilliant in his own way, and they're very different. And together they've written 2 or 3, like The Mote in God's Eye and Lucifer's Hammers are masterpieces of great science fiction. Both of those books, The Mote in God's Eye and Lucifer's Hammer, they're masterpieces. They should be hailed as that. Huh?
You took the words out of my mouth.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, they had prolific careers, and not all their stuff was gold, but that's fine. But they were otherized by that camp too. Oh, now I see it. You can see this running through Star Trek too. Just this disdain for religion and religious people, in script after script after script, after book after book after book, always pretending like they're being brave, daring, and all that when they're like that, to almost give the impression that science fiction isn't supposed to have spiritual elements, or if it does, it's just trashy fantasy.
Well, and this again goes back to the Futurians. Damon Knight, one of their key members, wrote numerous pieces of literary criticism, just trashing pulp writers like Robert E. Howard and even A.E. Van Vogt, who was once the third of the big 3. People forget that, and we forget it because Damon Knight just ran him out of town, just ruined his career.
A.E. Van Vogt was very popular at one time, and then he did drop off the radar. I remember that. Why did he drop off the radar? Did he turn religious or something?
Well, for one thing, he at least had the guts to talk about like Aristotelian philosophy. And I'll be honest, I haven't read his books yet. You want to talk to John C. Wright about Van Vogt? Van Vogt is his favorite science fiction author of all time. But no, Damon Knight didn't like him. It was more of a personal rivalry. And yeah, Knight just single-handedly destroyed Van Vogt's career. Because again, he saw to it that Van Vogt fell out of favor with the Central 50, with this clique that controlled all the gates to publishing.
That's interesting. And of course, these people also disdained well-known and some really quite good. For example, Madeleine L'Engle is a name that always comes up, wrote some simply brilliant fantasy science fiction, like the Wrinkle in Time series. Incredibly brilliant series, actually should be read by everyone. It's so good. Yet she was always snubbed by that science fiction and fantasy communities. And when I look, when you sit there and say the really great science fiction will always be materialist, naturalist, atheistic, anti-religion, holy cow, look at this old list. I mean, I've read Edgar Rice Burroughs. He's not primitive reading. I mean, there's some stuff in his work that's a little cringe now because 19th century imagination went away with him, but those are great books. L. Sprague de Camp is a really good writer. Robert E. Howard, well, he was never my favorite, but even H.P. Lovecraft, how is it that people don't think of H.P. Lovecraft as a great fantasy writer and a very spiritually oriented one in a very kind of sick way, or strange way?
Well,
these
now
people are spiritual and they're not materialists, and ideological atheists, Marxists, not Marxists, ideological atheists who disparage all idea of the supernatural kind of took over and bullied their way into taking over science fiction, didn't they?
Absolutely.
It's been going on for decade over decade too, because when we look at what goes on now, if you simply look at what's happening with places like Tor Books, and I think you mentioned Daw and and the Hugo Awards, it's very clear that a very nearly completely Marxist clique controls the Hugo Awards and most of the big names in science fiction publishing. And it's also very clear that from fan response and sales that their work sucks. They have nothing to offer in most cases. Not all, they're not completely without good authors, but science fiction seems to suck right now for a lot of fans, doesn't it?
It does, except in indie. That is where you're seeing the resurgence. And that is why science fiction and fantasy is the only genre. It's the only industry that's been attacked by SJWs that is experiencing a new spring now. It's back, if you know where to look.
Oh, because the gaming industry has not really recovered very well from the social justice leftist atheist takeover of the video game industry. Guys, you don't have to believe me. All you have to do is start looking. You talk to a social justice warrior, they're all atheists. A few will profess to be like a practicing Catholic or a practicing Methodist, but it's actually very rare. And quite frequently they're faking it. They really are. They're almost all the social justice left are ideological atheists. It's very obvious when you look at it. And the atheists they fight with are all libertarians, because you'll find, just go look for yourself. When an atheist doesn't go socialist, he usually heads right over to libertarianism. It's very predictable. It's like clockwork. And what I also notice is, because, okay, we've noticed some of these names used to be at least somewhat spiritual. Like, for example, there was some spirituality in Heinlein, especially as he aged. He started taking it more seriously, a common trend. We saw, oh man, I apologize, everybody. I just sort of lost my place. But Heinlein has been slowly erased from the canon. He was once considered one of the most important writers like to have ever lived ever, according to science fictiondom. And his reputation has gone down year over year over his political views, which weren't even particularly right-wing. They were just staunch libertarian. And who else? Oh, Ray Bradbury. There was a concerted and I think successful effort to almost erase Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was not particularly religious. he was more anti-religious or just totally uninterested, depending. But he was libertarian and very politically incorrect. And again, he's being slowly erased, isn't he?
He is, and that is the MO of the militant atheists and the social justice warriors and the cultural Marxists. They don't turn their fury directly on religious people in their midst. I mean, they'll show general low-grade contempt and dismissal, but when it comes to choosing their targets, they will take someone who's just like one slight deviation away from where the current narrative is and form up a pitchfork and torch-bearing witch hunt mob and run that person out. Again, like Card, he's an FDR Democrat, right? He's no right-winger. And like you pointed out with Heinlein, who was all into free love, and Bradbury, yeah, whose spirituality I think he described as kind of approximating Buddhism, right? Kind of this live and let live syncretism. But that's who they go after. They go after people who care about their
They start by trashing their reputation. They start by, and I'm going to flash a book here that I'm going to recommend reading. I know some people are going to blanch. They may not like Box Day. They may not like the phrase SJW. Maybe you're kind of a political moderate or even a little bit liberal. You should read this book anyway, because there's plenty of liberals who can tell you the truth of this book too. This book, SJWs Always Lie, describes perfectly what Brian here is describing. It really does. It describes it perfectly, and it usually goes in a very predictable pattern of declaring all the old ideas were stupid and awful and wrong, and we're going to go into a new, more exciting, bring in new audiences with new, more rational content that's more relevant and political, and all that stuff's in SJWs Always Lie. Also, the tendency to just come in and trash someone's reputation by first expressing concern over something, like they're your friend, or like, oh, they're very reluctantly noticing something bad about an old friend, and then a group of them all of a sudden swarms, and they're all over their chosen target. And that chosen target's audience, that chosen target usually flees or winds up getting his reputation slimed, or both. And it's happened to me a couple, 3 times. The only thing Vox Day wouldn't like me pointing out is I've had right-wingers do it too, who are also atheists. I often use the term atheists always lie, and it is in part inspired by this book, because I actually think when he talks about the thought police and the SJWs, he's ultimately talking about God-denying ideologues with a real hatred for Christianity, hatred for all religions, but especially for Christianity. I think if you scratch most of them, you'll find that's what's at the core of the Marxist ideology that this represents. And they work by a pattern that Brian just pointed out. You can see following Mutation or Death, this 1937 Futurians article. Ideological atheists have a way of worming their way in and pushing out anybody who won't be atheist with them. I've seen it time and time again, and it looks like this is pretty much what happened in a lot of science fiction. It's just interesting that it took decade over decade for it to happen.
It did, or rather to be noticed, right? It's kind of like boiling the frog. But what really blew the lid,
it actually kind of matches what we've seen happen in the universities too.
Absolutely, everywhere, every institution, Hollywood, comics, gaming. You brought those up, even some of the churches. But what really blew the lid off of science fiction was recently, we had the concerted revelations of Larry Correia doing Sad Puppies and proving that the Hugos were a popularity contest where a small ingrained clique was just log rolling, patting each other on the back, and handing out participation medals to each other. Then we had the advent of Amazon and KDP, where the gatekeepers were totally disintermediated, and now anyone can get published and let the readers decide what's good. And as my good buddy Nick Cole is showing with his Galaxy's Edge series, if you give people what they want, and there is a hunger, okay, for the older, pulpier, manly men doing manly things, escapism, action, and Nick is a very devout
And
Christian.
maybe even some old-fashioned good guys and bad guys.
Exactly.
Some old-fashioned good and evil, and causes actually worth fighting for.
Yes.
We need to get close. Although I hope we can come back and talk more about this, Brian.
Sure.
We've been going about 40 minutes now. Let's give ourselves and the audience a break. But I'll point out that this does matter. For example, a lot of people read The Lord of the Rings, and they don't see that it's a deeply Christian epic. But in point of fact, if you're deeply Christian, especially if you're Catholic or any kind of really serious Orthodox type Christian, you see it immediately because it suffuses the whole thing. And one of the many things that is there truly is good and evil. There truly is right and wrong. There really is love, and there really is hate. And that, which of course your ideological atheist says that's a bad way of doing things, but no, that's how the universe works, because there really is a good and evil, and it's not all simple stuff. I mean, again, I would challenge you to read The Lord of the Rings and tell me it's a simple, childish tale, because it's not that. But it's about good, evil, love, struggle, death, sacrifice, redemption, all those great Christian themes, actually.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we close up, Brian?
Yes, one thing I'd like to add to your stirring statement, stirring and true, is that you've identified what I think is the core problem with conservatives and libertarians who actually do look around at what's going on and are disturbed by it, and Christians all too often, is we have a tendency not to see fiction or art or entertainment as real, right? They tend to have, I don't know if it's the remnants of the Protestant work ethic or this pragmatism, right? This German pragmatism that has also influenced our culture. But conservatives tend to, they're good at building institutions, they're good at making innovations and producing new things. But then time and again, they cede them to the left, to Marxists, to atheists, really without
secularist atheists, yeah.
Every time it happened in science fiction, it happened in Hollywood. Walt Disney used to be famous. His only studio, and he was famous for having the only studio with zero communists because he identified them, rounded them all up, and fired them.
And the truth of the matter is, if he had just looked for the atheists, he would have had about a 90% successful score, especially in that era and in that place and time. It is very interesting, and what it points to is the fact that ideological atheism, which is at the core of a lot of very intolerant philosophies, they often brag that they're the tolerant ones, but they immediately want to shut up or silence anybody who won't be atheist with them.
Absolutely.
And if you don't want to atheist with them, you're a bad person, and it begins from there.
Correct.
Of course, maybe it won't be the proper type of atheist. So if you're a non-feminist atheist, they want you out too. But the atheism always seems to come with this intolerance of wanting to push out other ideas, especially if they're at all spiritual. You see it all the time, especially once someone points it out.
And unfortunately, they've been largely successful in many areas, which is why it's critical, as John Baptiste in the chat says, for Christians and believers and conservatives to take the field and start producing works in these fields. It has never been easier to be published. Now's the best time in the history of the human race to be an author. The wall, it's not that the gatekeepers are gone, the walls have fallen down around them. Go do it. Like I was saying, my buddy Nick Cole, he releases a book every month, and every month it goes to #1 in its category, like clockwork, because there is a hunger for this.
I will give another clue to aspiring young authors. You do not have to make a religious novel or even make God a central character in your book to suffuse your book with positive references of religiosity, of characters who do crazy things like pray for guidance or pray for a loved one. It's really not hard to become religion friendly, and I think a lot of audiences are going to respond, because guess what? most people aren't atheists and aren't going to be. And the final thing I'd add is, don't be afraid to start noticing what atheism actually looks like, because it's not an absence of belief. The atheist who's simply not interested, you can identify him pretty quickly. It's the atheist who has a real specific agenda to push out everything he considers primitive, wrong, unscientific, wrong think. Start noticing that, and the materialist atheist view, right away from that, right toward the spiritual. You don't have to change your work that much at all to improve it that way. Good and evil matter, in other words. Put that in your head, that there is good and evil, period. And
there's good and evil, right? Work's informed by it.
Exactly. All right, everybody, I hope we do come back and talk more about this. I love talking about old nerd stuff. I really do. But in the meantime, give us a like, give us a subscribe. Please tell your friends. Please tell your enemies. Please support our work. Please go check out Brian Niemeier. He's at brianniemeier.com. And you'll find write-ups on him on things like Superversives SF and things like that. We'll also have links in the low bar and on escapingatheism.com for you. So God bless everybody.